Have you ever wondered what it would be like to generate a semi-passive income from a business that you love and bought with little to none of your own money? How would it feel if you could finally buy that restaurant, salon, or any business for that matter without having to worry about where you were going to get the money from? Think of the lifestyle that would provide for you, your family, and even your retirement. These are the results that my good friend Ed Hills provides at his company Beyond Break Even. He provides world-class coaching on how to structure leverage buyouts for any business so that you can buy it without putting your own personal credit or net worth at risk. He's bought and sold over 25 companies personally over the course of his career and structured many more deals on the behalf of clients. And now he wants to help you learn over 100 ways to buy a business with none of your own money. And he also wants to teach you how to earn a six-figure income helping others do that exact same thing. So if you're ambitious and interested in buying a business with none of your own money, visit profitarchitects.com and give that number on the page a call, or fill out the request info form and they'll get back to you. Make sure you mention referral code MEMS for a special offer. Now, back to the episode.
Welcome back to Abundant Culture Podcast,
where we dissect the mindsets and tactics of the true beasts of business.
People like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, and Warren Buffett.
All to create a blueprint to experience life more abundantly.
Hey everybody, it's Joe here. Welcome back to the Abundant Culture Podcast. We're so glad to have you back again this week. Let me ask you a question. Did you know that when people leave their jobs, they're not actually running from the company itself, but they're actually running from their manager? I definitely didn't know this until this episode. And in this episode, we're going to discover the do's and don'ts of leadership and management. We're going to find out the leadership qualities that help build or break company cultures and give you, the leader, the tools that you need in order to go out and be effective with not only your customer, but your team as well. We're going to learn all of this from a leadership consultant who has helped very, very well-known companies such as Facebook, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Chase, and Ace Hardware. So get ready to listen to and learn from our good friend, Rob Sullivan.
So hi, Rob, and thank you again for coming on to the Abundant Culture Podcast. We are very glad to have you today because we love talking about like company cultures and all those cool different things. But before we get into like all the management questions and everything, we have to ask you, how did you get into business? Like what's the backstory behind that?
Well, the backstory behind it is that this is a career that picked me. I didn't pick it. And it all started, the first job I wanted when I got out of school was to work in advertising at Leo Burnett here in Chicago. And it took me a year to get that job and 80 interviews to get that job. But after I did it for about 4 years, I'm like, you know what, is this all there is? So I moved on from that, did a bunch of different things. And the common themes throughout that were coaching people, whether it was people who were in transition looking for a job or coaching salespeople, coaching managers, that kind of thing. And it was all around, the common thread in that was communication, helping people be better communicators, which was somewhat ironic if you had asked some of my former girlfriends, but it was, that's how it all started.
Cool. That's really cool. So can you shed a little bit of light on like, your process that you really take people through whenever you're like, let's say you're coaching a salesperson on communication? I always was curious about how that's done because I know over time I've become a lot better communicator than I used to be. But if somebody asked me to kind of teach them how to become a better communicator, I wouldn't even know where to start. So like, what's really the process behind that?
Well, the big thing is, I'll do a lot of ride-alongs with people in addition to teaching workshops, and I love teaching workshops. That's my bread and butter. That's what I do most. But I am also out there on the road with salespeople, watching them on their calls. I watch managers run their meetings, and in watching them, there's plenty of opportunities to coach just when you see how people communicate, because in many cases, they're giving their power away. And it's not about power, because you don't want power over anybody, so that's not necessarily the right way to phrase it. But they're creating a scenario where they're not on the same level as the people they're talking to. They're putting themselves down. And, let's face it, in sales especially, customers are looking for partners in many cases. They want somebody that they respect, who they value their opinion. And if I'm constantly asking you for permission, being like, oh, hey, would it be okay if we did this? And, can I ask you a couple questions about this? And all this permission seeking stuff, unconsciously at some point, you will not see me as a partner, because you won't see me as an equal if I keep lowering my status relative to you.
That's interesting.
And so watching that and then coaching people on it is a really big part.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I think, I can't remember, I was listening to some sales training. I think it was Pitch Anything, and it was talking about the importance of status. Can you kind of expand on that idea of why status may be a little important when it comes to marketing or sales?
Sure. Well, let me first say that what I'm speaking about is a cultural thing, in the sense that what I'm talking about here applies specifically in the US. It doesn't necessarily apply, and it wouldn't apply in countries like Asia or wherever, because there's different rules of engagement when it comes to interacting with people. And I don't profess to be an expert on other cultures, but I can tell you, I know enough about other cultures to know that there are certain things that you do and don't do that just don't happen here. So with that said, there's different levels of relationship you could have with a customer. The lowest level, if we're going to talk about sales, the lowest level of relationship would be, what we lovingly refer to as the professional visitor. These are people who had no value whatsoever. They might bring donuts, right? So that's not where we want to be. But if you move up from that, the next level, think of it as a pyramid. The next level of the pyramid, 40 to 50% of salespeople fall in the category of commodity, or another phrase for it is order taker. So if you're an order taker, you're at the end of your customer's buying process, because they've already done all the thinking. They've made the plans. They've decided what it is that they want. And so they're shopping around, and they're shopping around for what price? So the lower you are from that status standpoint, if you're a commodity or an order taker, then you're going to be fighting the price battle. Moving up from that is what we refer to as the technical expert. About 20 to 30% of people would fall in that category. And then those are the people who customers clearly see that there's an expertise that they can tap into, when they work with people like that, and that there's value that those people bring. And the top level, the only 10% of salespeople ever get here, is what we call the advisor or partner level. This is where you've got a customer who calls you about things that have nothing to do with what you sell. They might be calling you for advice about something completely different, in addition to the expertise that they tap in your industry. So, that's a great level to reach. The problem is you're never going to reach that level if your language is keeping you from reaching that level. And that's what I mean. When people are constantly asking for permission, they're saying, hey, can I ask you a question? Would it be okay if we do this? That through our language, in many cases, we lower our status. A really common example is, somebody calls up and they say, yeah, I just want to check in and see how you're doing. Well, you're telegraphing in that moment that the other person's time is more valuable, and that that you're being a pest. And so there's all kinds of things that people do. Contrast that with, I'm calling to check in. We'd sent the proposal last week. I wanted to get your thoughts. There's, at that moment, we're on the exact same level. But if I'm saying, hey, I just wanted to see if you've looked at our proposal. I just, wanted to see if you have time next week. All that stuff, it communicates really strongly, and sometimes unconsciously, that you and I are not on the same level.
Wow.
That's crazy, because as you were saying that, I'm like, wow, I guess I do kind of sound like that. I need to change the wording that I use.
Yeah. And it's
everybody does. And it shows up in email too. Yeah.
Wow, I never really even thought about that. And we read that book, Pitch Anything, and we heard about it a little bit, but it's something that you need a constant reminder of, because I feel like we live in a world where, you go to McDonald's, and obviously that's kind of on the lower to commodity level that you were talking about. And I feel like the consumer is so used to being treated that way, that a lot of times, even when we, put our producer hat on and get ready to sell a product or a service, that sometimes we just think back to all those times where, somebody took our order, so we end up taking their order, when we're actually supposed to be advising them or be a partner to them. And I think that's so key. And that's such a ability that I think people should need to foster, whether they work in an organization or are the owner of that organization.
Exactly. Yeah. And the way that I look at it is salespeople, and for many of the reasons that you just talked about, maybe they've had the training at McDonald's, and McDonald's provides really good training for customer service, as an order taker, but not as a partner. Right. And so if I'm looking at you and I'm saying things like, well, the things that we talked about before, but, take something as subtle as, oh, thanks so much for taking time to meet with me today. Okay. Their time is clearly more valuable because I'm gushing in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks so much that's an imbalance. It's subtle, but it's there. And all these things add up. And I literally watched a team that was presenting, and I'll never forget, this is a commercial banking team. They had spent 6 months trying to get this deal. And through their words, they sabotaged the whole thing in less than 5 minutes. And when you're talking about the commercial banking area, their deals run between $50 and $200 million, and they've spent 3 to 6 months preparing for that presentation. So they've invested between $50 and $150,000 of their company's time preparing for that, and they threw it out the window with the language. And I kid you not, what the prospect said at the end of that presentation was, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'm not feeling confident moving forward. Well, I can put my finger on it. It was the words they were using, and they were operating at an unconscious level. I went back. I laid it all out. This is what happened. But unfortunately, it's not something you can really recover from very easily, because if you set that or plant that seed of doubt, it's done. If they question you and you're at that level where there's that much money at stake, the likelihood that they would move forward ever is not that high.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's amazing that even in commercial banking, something that you would think that is very analytical and something that is driven solely by the numbers, somebody can turn down a $50 to $200 million deal because of a gut feeling. So I think
exactly. Isn't it wild?
Yeah, that is very wild. So can you also tell me a little bit about the persistence behind it taking you, I should have asked this before, but the 80 interviews to get into the advertising company, that's something that I like. When I heard that, I'm like, wow, this is somebody who understands persistence. And I kind of wanted for you to shed light on that and kind of explain to us why you were willing to go on 80 interviews or 80 tries in order to get that job at the advertising firm.
Sure. It was, well, when I first heard about advertising, I'd been working, I did radio in high school and college at our stations, and I got really interested in media. And then I saw this presentation from a guy who's now a friend of mine at Leo Burnett, and he got me excited about it. When I first thought about it, I wasn't even thinking about me. I was thinking about my friend Andy. But then I realized later, I'm like, this is be the perfect job. And so I got excited about it. I interviewed and I did a horrible job. I'll spare you the gory details other than to say that I did the entire interview in one breath, which is not a good strategy. So I was super nervous and it was terrible. But they saw enough in me that they brought me in for a full day of interviews. And then they said, you know what, we're not going to be able to offer you a job. But they said, we never shut the door on anybody, come back. And in that year, I went to grad school. I continued to interview. I interviewed in New York, Minneapolis, Chicago, all over the place. And it was just something that I really wanted to do. And I'm glad I did it. I'm the kind of person, I don't stop. If I get a goal, I'm going to keep going. And I'm proud of myself that I got Leo Burnett to hire me a year later. I was not a different person, but it took 80 interviews in advertising, 23 interviews at Leo Burnett to get that job. And then that was really what led to everything else. Because then I joined the recruiting team and I realized on the other side of the desk, what mistakes I was making that were painfully obvious to me, although I didn't see it when I was interviewing. Yeah. And so it was my commitment to pay it forward for all the people who had helped me along the way. That was why I wrote my first book, Getting Your Foot in the Door When You Don't Have a Leg to Stand On. And it led to all of the coaching and everything that I do now. My career has evolved quite a bit, in terms of where my focus is. It isn't solely on advertising so much anymore. It's more, I help people in advertising, but it's more about other things.
Yeah, for sure.
That's cool.
And can you talk about maybe some of the common mistakes that you found when people are interviewing for positions that they really, really want or desire? Because
I've had experiences. I feel like I've had really good experiences and really bad experiences when it comes to interviewing. And I don't always consciously know what will make a good experience. So can you expand upon that a little bit?
Absolutely. I will do my best. This is a 3-day workshop, but I'll condense into something a bit shorter.
Yeah.
So the single biggest mistake that people make is they're not specific. They don't provide evidence. There is absolutely no reason to believe anything that they're saying because they don't back it up with anything. And so you'll see this on LinkedIn, and just resumes in general. You'll see people talk about their proven track record. I'm sorry, I've never gotten excited about somebody because they have a proven track record. That means nothing. If I ever see that word again, I'll probably violently throw up. It's awful. What I want to know is, I want the facts. Give me the facts. I don't want the flowery adjectives, because I'll make my own judgment about whether what you did was good or not. But I don't want you telling me how fabulous you are in adjectives. I want you telling me how fabulous you are in real life experiences and a reason to believe that you're going to do a good job. I was guilty of this. It would not have taken me 80 interviews to get the job if I had known that and if I had been more in touch with that. I've changed careers now 6, 7, 8 times, depending on how you want to count. Every single time I did it in one interview. It's not an accident. It's because I learned how to do it. And we're talking about radical career changes. I went from advertising to options trading. I went from options trading to headhunting. I ended up writing a tutorial. I got hired by an options trading website to write their online tutorial, sales training, headhunting. I've done a lot of different things. Every single one of those jobs I got in one interview. And I didn't have a track record. If you had looked at the logic, in terms of logical flow of my career progression, you wouldn't have hired me to walk your dog. But it was something that I learned how to do. All you've got to do is take the risk out of it for people, and that's the big thing. People don't take. They don't understand what risk means to whether it's a customer, a hiring manager, or whatever. And so once you realize what that is, then it's easier to go back and try to get rid of that.
Awesome. And that's really, really great too. That's really key, because I think a lot of people, like when they're writing resumes, they're trying to think about how to, spruce themselves up instead of showcasing actual skills that they have. Can you and for you, I was kind of wondering, how were you able to take the risk out of hiring you for an industry that you've actually, never really worked in? Were you just expanding upon the skills that you learned in the previous industry and telling them how that works for this one? Or how did you actually do that?
Well, you can do it in a few different ways. The biggest challenge and the easiest one to point to is people who are right out of school, because they don't have experience by definition. And at the entry level, no one would expect them to, yet they have to sell themselves on potential. We are all selling ourselves on potential, unless unless you're going for a job that you've basically done before at the competitor, which in my question then would be why aren't you going for something higher? It's always about potential. And so how do you sell that? How do you convince people? Well, a big part of it is to trace your passion, help people understand why they're not taking a risk. You look at the average person, like when I would be interviewing advertising candidates, as an example, one of the questions that I thought was going to be a throwaway question was, tell me one of your best ideas ever. Because theoretically, if you want to get into an ideas industry, you would have had one at some point. Most of the people looked at me with a blank stare. They were like, oh, well, I don't know. Let me think about that. I'm just sitting here going, what's the connection? Why would you want to do this if that's not how you think? It doesn't make any sense. Now, one young woman looked at me and she said, I have had so many good ideas. Let me take a minute and think about which one I like best. I was like, okay, great. And then she shared a really cool story. I was like, all right, great. I like her. There were people who, and it doesn't matter what the idea is. And they were random. I remember one person who's like, their best idea ever was to have a house with 2 dishwashers so they'd never have to unload. I'm like, that's a pretty cool idea. Yeah. So I just want to know how people think. Yeah. But if you can't give me any evidence of how you think, then I'm not terribly interested in having you on my team. As an example, if I need you to have ideas,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's like an excellent question too. And when you said it, I was like, I would have thought that would have been a throwaway question too, but it's genius.
Right.
It's a really good question.
learning about their character, it seems like, more than their skill set.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so another question I would ask people, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with measuring their potential, but to get to the point about the character, I'd ask them a series of questions about, I'd start out and I'd say, what are 5 adjectives your best friend would use to describe you? And then I would say, what are, somebody who doesn't know you well doesn't like you. What are 5 adjectives that person would use to describe you? And then I would say, what are 5 adjectives you might use to describe me? And the idea behind this, I got this from one of my bosses. He's a great guy. And his name was Tom. And he told me that he did this. And I was like, I took on it and I built on it because I was like, I love what he was doing. The first question is, how would your best friend describe you? You wouldn't believe how many people look at me and say, like, oh, detail oriented. I'm like, they don't love you because you're detail oriented. Knock off. Yes. What is it that they like about you?
Yeah.
People, then sometimes people would, be a little bit more open. The question about somebody who doesn't know you well, doesn't like you, what I'm going for there is, how aware are you of how you come across? Like for me, I know I have resting jerk face. So like if somebody who doesn't know me, they might describe me as intense, condescending, a lot of words that people who know me wouldn't use. So it doesn't mean that they're true. It just means that that's how you're coming across. And then my follow-up question to that, at the end, after I go through all this is, okay, so let's imagine that you're on a team with somebody and, you've just met and you're not having a really good chemistry and you think that they might describe you as, and then I'll read back their adjectives. I'll say, how would you handle that? It's amazing what you learn about people. I remember one guy was like, oh, well, he goes, that would have to be my boss. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that's odd, but all right. And then I said, well, what would you do? He's like, well, I talked to his secretary. And I'm thinking, okay, at what point are you going to talk to him? And I said, well, what if you didn't get any good information from the secretary? He said, well, I'd call his wife at home. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm not hiring you, because that person has no judgment. And they clearly don't have the ability to have a conversation with the person they need to talk to.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want somebody who's going to be in avoidance mode constantly. I want, if you and I have an issue, let's you and I talk about it, not you talk to 12 other people who are then going to talk to me and then I'm going to talk to them and they're going to talk to the person. It's like, no, why do people communicate like that?
Yeah.
That's not somebody I would ever hire.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's strange too, because it seems like that's exactly how a lot of corporations operate. It's like you want to, you have a problem with somebody who's maybe a level or 2 levels up, and then you have to go through all of these other people in order just to talk to that person. And I always felt like that was very inefficient. So it's really good to hear that you also think that same thing.
Well, not only is it inefficient, it's disrespectful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you have an issue with me and you're not giving me a chance to resolve it, shame on you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
So what do you think about the questions like what is your biggest strength and what is your biggest weakness? Because that's asked like so much in interviews.
Right. Okay. So the weakness question, I don't ask at all. And I don't recommend that people ask it. A, because it's expected and everybody knows it's coming. And B, because it just doesn't, it's not helpful. It scares people unnecessarily. And the question, the 5 adjectives about somebody who doesn't know you well, doesn't like you, that's your weakness. That's a weakness, right? Is how are you coming across when you're not coming across the way you want to come across? And so I would turn that around. If somebody said, what's your weakness? I might say, sometimes, for people who don't know me, they might see me as intense or, and I have to work a little harder. Somebody who grew up in downtown Chicago, smiling at complete strangers is not something I do naturally, but I'm working on it, right? So that's being more approachable. That to me it is a weakness for what I do too, because, I need people to know that I'm approachable. And if they don't feel like I am at first blush, that's a weakness. So that's the answer to that question. And so that's why I ask something different, because I'm tired of hearing people say, oh, I'm a perfectionist or chocolate or something totally ridiculous, because it doesn't help me understand. The spirit of the question is good, but the execution is horrible.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's like people are incentivized not to be totally transparent during interviews. And when you're asking them questions like that, a lot of times you're not gonna get the real, answer.
Exactly. I want the real answer, because think about this. I'm going to be spending more waking time with this person than I would with a spouse or family member. I don't want to hire the fake version of you. I want to know who you are. Who you are is either going to be a fit or it's not. But if you hide that from me, then there's a higher likelihood that it isn't going to be a fit.
Yeah. Because eventually is what I found is it's definitely going to come out one day.
Absolutely. And I'm not looking for perfection. Nobody's perfect. I'm looking for somebody who can admit their mistakes, somebody who, there's certain qualities that are going to be important. It depends on the job, but excuse me, I want to know that this person has some of the skills that I would never be able to teach them, or maybe don't have time.
That's a really awesome point. So when you're actually hiring somebody or talking to a manager about hiring, I always hear this split between hard skills and soft skills and personality and chemistry. Would you say like the actual technical skills, like how important is that to you in the hiring process?
It depends on the position, but the bottom line is this: I can teach you, maybe not me, but people can be taught almost anything if it's important. Now, obviously, if you're going for a CFO level position, I'm not looking for somebody that we need to teach accounting to, because theoretically they should already have all of that handled along with finance and everything else. So there's a certain, you have to ask yourself, what are the core skills that are at a minimum what we're looking for. But that whole idea of, do they have to have absolutely everything? No, not necessarily. What I want, if they don't have something, I want a reason to believe they're going to pick it up quickly. So that goes back to evidence. So tell me about something where somebody asked you to do something and you didn't have the experience, but you made things happen and got results in a really short period of time. That's the kind of evidence that I'm looking for, because I want to know that you have initiative and that you can work through a challenge like that. I'm not looking for perfection on day one.
Absolutely. I love it. Go ahead.
So what is the importance of like good management and good leadership?
Huge. The number one reason people leave companies is because they're managers. I laugh every year when that 100 best companies to work for in America survey shows up, because if you have the worst manager at the best company to work for in America, you may as well be at the worst company to work for in America, because there's no difference. It all starts and ends with the manager. Yeah. And so when I coach teams, it's heartbreaking to see how many managers who maybe have never had training, so it's not necessarily their fault, have had just constant attrition and issues because people leave because they don't like their leadership style. And they don't know any different. And then you try to coach them, and sometimes they've got habits, and sometimes they're not totally forthcoming with what exactly is going on. It can be challenging to coach people in that regard, but that's why training is so important, because things that you would think, it's not a common sense job. There are tons of books written on leadership and management, and there's principles you need to know. You can't delegate to everybody the same way, because it depends where they're at from what we call a readiness standpoint. Are they willing and able? And that's a key thing, because there's 4 variations of that. Not willing, not able, not willing and able, able and not willing. You can break it all apart. I got to coach all those people differently. I can't just, look at you and say, okay, I'm going to have you do this. And by the way, you're going to do this too. Because if you're in 2 different places, then I just screwed it up right from the start. And so management, I could go on for days, because this is another long training that I do, but there's almost nothing more important in a company that you've got good management in place.
Yeah. And that's really amazing, because there's some companies, even include my own sometimes, where I'm always amazed why the people are as loyal as they are. And then other companies where it's like, man, this looks like a sweet gig and everybody's quitting. So it's always very fascinating to me. I was like, we own a coffee shop, so I asked all my employees the other day, I was like, so do you guys just literally like being like baristas? And they were like, yeah, we like being baristas. And also we sent out like an anonymous survey to kind of get feedback, and where they could be brutally honest and not have to worry about being, the guy who said this. Yeah. And they were talking about how they like them, their the coworkers, and they also enjoy the management too, and the leadership. So and it's very fascinating to me because I look at all those people and I'm like, man, you could probably get paid a little bit better, to be honest, somewhere else. But they stay. And then I do have know people in my own life who they'll have a job and it pays a very nice salary, and they're like miserable and cannot wait for a reason to quit. So I think that really goes back to good management and leadership.
Yeah, and it starts with the culture too. I mean, the thing that impressed me about Burnett and why I wanted to work there in the first place, it's such a strong culture. I don't think it's still true, but when it was a private company, people. One of the questions I asked in interviews, I said, what's something about this company that you wish everybody knew that nobody, that they might not think to ask? Now, that doesn't beg for a positive or a negative question. They could look at me and say something horrible, or they could look at me and say something great. And I still remember one guy looked at me and he said, he's like, I love this company. He said, my wife and I have been having a hard time having a kid. And he said, the company's giving us several $1,000s to help us adopt a child. It's like, wow, that's a cool benefit. Yeah. And the fact that was the very first thing he thought to tell me about this company, like, now I get why people stay and want to be here their whole career. Because it wasn't just words on a page saying, oh, we've got a family-oriented culture or whatever. They lived and breathed it.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And you also mentioned it might have had a better culture when it was a privately owned company. Do you believe that it's just simpler for a privately owned company to have that culture, or is it just a coincidence that had to be the company that kind of?
No, the problem is when you get into publicly traded companies, or the worst of all possible scenarios, private equity based companies. Private equity people think they're the smartest people in the room. They're not. Invariably, here's the thing with leadership, and we teach this in leadership training. You got to be goal oriented and you have to be people oriented. Private equity is goal oriented, 100% goal oriented. They could care less about the people. They're interchangeable parts as far as they're concerned. That's a huge mistake. People are not interchangeable parts. And right. So, if you value the people equally with the goals, you're going to end up in a good place. But when you get in a situation where people are looking at the numbers, it doesn't work that way. There was I don't remember the name of it, but I remember hearing a year or two ago that there's a new stock exchange that they're creating where they're allowing companies not to have to do quarterly earnings because they don't want the focus to be on what are the numbers right now, because the numbers right now do not tell the story. And having worked with salespeople, I can tell you there's when they project out and they say, oh, well, got a really high degree of certainty that this is going to close. Half the time it's not a pipeline, it's a pipe dream. They're never going to hit those numbers. And so, it's if there's too much focus on the bottom line, and you have to be focused on the bottom line because we're all in business to make money, and if we don't make money, we won't be in business. But the problem with the publicly traded and as I said, the private equity, then it's too focused on the money. Doesn't work.
Absolutely, and that really makes sense because for us, when we got into the businesses that we're in, we always knew that we kind of wanted to change this idea of being in business just for money because we tried that. Crashed and burned horribly. Well, actually didn't crash and burn. Nothing happened actually. So absolutely nothing happened. But we wanted to change that mindset to let's focus on creating the best company culture that we can, and then just see what happens to the bottom line. Yeah. And a lot of times, like we were surprised, like when we bought this coffee shop location, at how just very, very small, minute tweaks to not only the culture, but also like, simple stuff like signage or whatever, really boosted the top line sales in that company. And I was like, wow, like this is actually a real thing. Culture, even though you can't say, oh, it's going to be a 20% return or this percent return, it does have some type of return, and you just have to kind of wait in order to see what that is.
Oh, for sure. I know one company where they fired a $100 million client because of the negative impact it was having on the morale of their team. And they said, time out. We spent a lot of time and money recruiting the best people in the world to do this job. And we're not letting a single client drive them away. And kudos to them. They were a private company at the time. They were able to retain all of those employees, even though some of them didn't have a new assignment for up to 2 years. A public company would never be able to do that.
Oh no, absolutely not. It just wouldn't work. Their shareholders would blow a gasket if they did that.
Well, that's the unfortunate thing. They assume that shareholders are idiots and money focused. I, as a shareholder, would want you to be making the right business decision, and I'm trusting that you're in that position to do that. And if the right business decision is keeping people and paying them, then that's exactly what you should do. That's one of the hugest mistakes that companies make. Like with salespeople, they'll do really well and they'll look at it and go, oh, wow, look at how much money we're paying these salespeople. And it's like, yeah, they're earning it. And so cutting somebody's commission is the dumbest strategy of all, because all you manage to do is take your top performers and get them to go look for another job. Really? Yeah. What sense did that make? The myth is that, it's possible to pay people too much money. No, your biggest risk is not paying somebody too much money. Your biggest risk is paying the wrong person at all. If you've got a good employee and they're profitable, assuming that, the whole relationship is profitable, there are companies that will offer commissions on deals that are not profitable to the company. I don't know how you can do that and stay in business, but assuming that everything else is equal and you're profitable after you paid the commission, then, great. Keep doing it. It's working.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at a company and you're looking to coach somebody who is considered maybe like a top level performer, how are you looking at that? Or are you even looking to coach top performers?
You got to coach everybody. But the thing with top performers is that you don't do much. You figure out where they need support and you make sure that you provide it. And that's about it. You stay out of their way. Because if they're a top performer, they don't need to be micromanaged. They don't need you in their business constantly. They just need to know that you're there in case you need them. So I'll never forget, I was leading a management training, and this one young woman came up to me. She was a recently promoted manager, and she had one of the top salespeople in the company on her team. She was in tears. She's like, I don't know what I need to do to fix him. I looked at him. I go, don't fix him. Get down on your hands and knees and thank God that you got a really good person, and just ask him where he needs help, because you can open doors for him that he might not be able to open simply because you're at a higher level. But I said, leave him alone. Stop trying to fix him. You don't need to do that. Put your energy somewhere else. I said, if you do that, you're going to drive him away. He will leave.
Yeah, for sure. What about the underperforming people? What is your process with them? I'm assuming that is very, very different, but shed a little bit of light on that.
Sure. Underperformers are interesting because my big question is, why are they underperforming? Because unless you're really bad at recruiting, they didn't start there. So, what happened to cause them to get into this place where it's not working very well? Sometimes we refer to it as the dead zone, if it's really gotten bad. And the question is it salvageable? Is it something, let's take it's not too far gone. It's salvageable. We can do something about it. A more typical scenario, right? They all happen, by the way, but somebody who is not performing, first I want to figure out why. So, and what kind of a gap are we talking about? Is it a skill gap? Is it a will gap? Is it a knowledge gap? Because they're not all the same. If it's a knowledge gap, knowledge is binary. I can teach you what you don't need, what you didn't know, and once you know it, you should be okay. It's like, to use a really simple analogy, you teach somebody how to tie their shoes, you never have to do it again. A skill gap is a bit different because I can teach you all the keys on a piano, but it doesn't mean you're going to be able to play a Beethoven sonata tonight. You need to practice. You need to, learn. There's higher levels of learning with that. And then the will gap. If you think of it as a triangle, and so these are the three common gaps. The will gap is the most insidious because it's often referred to as an attitude problem, but many, many times it's a skill gap in disguise. So when somebody seems like they've got a bad attitude or they're not working, chances are good they need some training. You just have to figure out where it is.
So how do you kind of figure out like what that gap is, as far as like the skill gap, if it is like the attitude problem?
Okay, so let me give you a real life scenario. I'm working with a manager at a hotel, and one of the people on the team has what they perceive as an attitude problem. It's a person on the catering side, and she's constantly promising things to clients, and she's been taught and told not to do that. And so she's losing trust within the team internally. Things are not good. And whenever they ask her about it, they're like, "Why are you doing this? We told you not to do this." She's like, "Oh, but we're customer focused. We've got to deliver what the customer needs." And her answers sounded good, but they weren't. There was something else going on. And the woman came to me and she said, "I don't know what to do." And I asked her, "So what kind of a gap are we looking at here?" She said, "Oh, it's definitely an attitude problem." And as I thought about it, and as we learned a little bit more, and I asked a few more questions, I tuned in because I'm very intuitive, and that's a big part of how I coach people. And people are often surprised. I'll say, I don't know the person, but based on what I'm hearing, I'm getting a feeling that what you're dealing with is. And they'll look at me and go, "Oh my gosh, how did you know that?" Which is cool. At first, I wasn't always comfortable sharing that, and I wasn't even comfortable tapping into it. But now I do it all the time, and I have great results from it. So in this particular case, here's what happened. When I tuned into this woman to try to get a sense of thinking about it from her point of view, it's really the ultimate in empathy. I'm not trying to look at it from the manager's point of view. This is how am I going to fix this person? It's like, what's going on? Because if you truly understood a person, they're not behaving irrationally. They're behaving very rationally based on the way they view the world. And so I tuned into her, and short version of the story is she had two skill gaps that she was missing. The first one is she doesn't know how to say no. That's a skill. I had a manager at Burnett who did not know how to say no. It was a disaster. It led to all kinds of fire drills that never should have happened. And so the ability to look at somebody and say, "I get that this is really important to you. We're not going to be able to do it." That's a skill, and it requires some training. The other thing is she didn't know how to negotiate, because those two things go hand in hand. If I, am telling you no, then what can I do for you? And she really didn't have much skill in that area. So we began to work with her on those two components because that was what was missing. It looked like an attitude problem. It wasn't that attitude problem at all.
Oh, wow. And that's very insightful too, because I feel like one of that manager's mistakes was that they kind of jump to a conclusion on that person without necessarily digging deep into the problem. And that's something that, I seek to have the ability to do. And I'm still new at, managing people and running a company and stuff like that. So I'm still learning. So this podcast episode is great for me, but, being able to say, no, like this is what it seems to be on the surface. Let's see what it is deep down at the root of the problem before I make a decision.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets tricky. And this is why intuition is so important. That team member is never going to look at you and say, "Oh, I don't know how to say no, and I'm terrible at negotiating."
Exactly.
They don't know what they don't know. So it's in that category of they're never going to be able to tell you. And it's not that they don't want to tell you, it's just that they don't realize it. And so you've got to figure it out and connect the dots without thinking about all the pressure that's on you and making it about you. Because it's too many people, we look at the world from our own point of view, and we never really look at the world from anybody else's point of view. And when you take a few minutes and sit down and imagine you are that other person, you have a completely different viewpoint of whatever it is. And I've used that for negotiation. I've used it for coaching. It really does make a difference to stop for a second, shut off your own filters, and just really imagine that you are the person that you're interacting with.
Absolutely.
So what's the biggest mistake that you see managers make?
Oh, so many. The biggest mistake is, I was thinking about that this morning too, as I was getting ready for this. The biggest mistake is really not knowing their team very well. Not having that empathy to be able to tune in and to recognize when something has become more draining than energizing and when people are sliding into that dead zone. Because if you can tap into that and you have a pulse for what's happening with your team, things are going to go a lot more smoothly. If you're, there's nothing wrong with being hands off, but you have to be hands on enough to know what's happening. So finding that balance of not micromanaging, but not, being just unavailable either. So
yeah, for sure. And based off of that, what are some, I guess, you would say maybe the top 3 tips for managers to actually succeed with their team?
Okay, perfect. So the first one is be strategic about recruiting. That's really important. We talked earlier about those innate qualities. Who is this person? What are the things that we need them to be? Who do we need them to be that we can't train them to be? And so if you've been smart about that and you recruited somebody who's genuinely interested in the business and is going to go that, take the extra, do the extra, work that the average person might not necessarily do because they do have initiative, that's a great place to start. Now, if you inherited the person, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But from a recruiting standpoint, you want to make sure that you got the right person in the first place. Second one, involve teams in the decision. You got a challenge in front of you. Don't sit there and put all the weight on your shoulders and try to figure it out for yourself. Example of that, I'll be working with sales managers and they'll say, oh, we've got, the company just increased our quota 20% and I don't know how we're going to hit that number. And then they try to figure out how they're going to divide it out among the team and who's going to have to do what. And I said, no, don't do that. I said, because think about it from the team member's perspective. Do you want to be told what to do in the face of a challenge like that? Or do you want to be involved in the decision to be able to sit down with your team and say, here's what the company's asking us. I'm honestly, I need some help with how are we going to do this? What makes the most sense? Let's together come up with a plan. I'm going to feel empowered as a team member in that conversation. I'm not going to feel empowered if the person sat there, stayed awake for, how many nights trying to figure it out and then came and dictated to me what I needed to do. So involve teams in the decision. That's number 2. Yeah. And then the third thing, and we talked about this already a bit, but it comes back to the original part of the conversation, which is watch your words. The worst performing team that I coached, and it was at a project where I watched a lot of different managers within this company. The lowest ranking team from a performance standpoint was led by the manager with the worst communication style. He was the one who was constantly asking people, oh, hey, could you give me an update on this account? Would it be okay if we did this? I was thinking about riding along with you on your next call. Is that okay? All this permission seeking stuff, along with, a ton of other communication flaws that I work with people on. No surprise, he's got the worst performing team. And the sad part of that is, and why this is such a big deal, is that your team will mirror you as manager. So if you have ineffective communication styles, guess who's picking that up? It's like kids with their parents. And so they go out then, and what happens? They get in front of customers and they start doing the same thing. Oh, it would be okay if we did this. What do you need us to do? All these totally ineffective approaches. So watch your words. That's number 3.
Absolutely.
I love those.
Yeah.
And it seems like you need some of the characteristics of like a good manager, where skills is empathy and lots of humility. Are there any other like top skills that you think managers need?
Well, the biggest one that leads to all of that is listening. I've got, and when I say listening, it's not just listening on the surface. I have an entire workshop that I do on listening. And there's different reasons that people listen. If you think about it, sometimes people listen to understand. Sometimes they listen for enjoyment. Sometimes they listen to sabotage. They want to hear, what's the thing that I can pounce on? Managers do that all the time. Yeah. And so how are we listening? Are we truly listening to understand it, to get a sense of what's happening? Or are we listening because we have our own agenda in mind and we're trying to put that forth?
Wow.
Yeah. And another thing I was really wanted to chime in on was that second one that you spoke about, was that just having the ability. What was it? The second one was.
Oh, the second one was involve the team.
Involve the team. I think that's awesome, because I feel like a lot of times as the manager wants to feel like the responsible one, the smartest one on the team. That's why they're the manager. And I even witnessed this in one of our own team meetings with me. I was telling the team kind of like the goal, what I kind of wanted to accomplish. And I told them I didn't have it all together yet, but I was kind of sitting there brainstorming it. And literally one of the employees right across the table said, well, why don't you just do this? And I was like, holy crap. I thought about this for about 3 weeks straight, and she came up with this in like 3 seconds. And it was the most brilliant thing. So I think anybody listening, you should really try to really find the gold in your team, because they have abilities, knowledge, experiences that you don't have. It doesn't matter if you're somebody who has a decade's worth of experience and they're in their first year, they still have experienced things that you have not. So I think that's really, really invaluable.
Absolutely. A good idea can come from anywhere, and they're on the front lines. There's a much bigger chance that they've thought about it even more than you have.
Yes, for sure. Definitely.
So what is the number one takeaway that you like for someone to get from this episode?
Number one takeaway by far, trust your intuition. Yeah, we've all had a gut instinct that we didn't follow and later wished we had. That's what they're there for. Yeah, that's a big one. And if I could have it, can I have a second one?
Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
It would be to have an abundant mentality and not a scarcity mentality. That's one of the biggest challenges that I see with companies. And it's not just companies, it's people. So on the people level, it shows up most often when people say, oh, I don't have enough money. I don't have enough of this. I don't have enough of that. And so and I worked really hard to overcome my scarcity mentality around money. The other thing, though, it plays out in business because you've got companies that will say, well, if I build this road and it lasts, more than a year or two, then I'm going to be out of business because nobody's going to hire me. It's like nonsense. No, if you build a road that lasts, then I can hire you to do something else rather than redoing the work that you didn't do well the first time. But we do that. We have companies have a scarcity mentality. One of the first light bulbs built by Thomas Edison is still burning 1 million hours later. We know how to create light bulbs that last. We choose not to because we have a scarcity mentality around that. And it shows up in 1 million different ways. So, have an abundant mentality, believe that there are more than enough customers out in the world, that there are more than enough ideas. If you are, overly protective of things and you have this feeling like, oh, we got to do it this way. It's what led companies, when you don't hear about them anymore, but Beechnut was a company that, their scarcity mentality was around, it led to basically illegal behavior because they created a baby apple juice that contained no apple juice. Excuse me? And they got sued, and as they should have. But how was it that they were able to do that for so long and people didn't blow the whistle on them? We need to hold people accountable for stuff. The lack of integrity that starts with a scarcity mentality is rampant. We need we need honest people who can help us get past that.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah. And I have another question that's for me, honestly. I meant to ask it before, but when it comes to, you talked about the permission-seeking behavior. How can somebody quickly just catch that and change their language to somebody who will be more of an advisor or a partner?
Okay, so there's an acronym I want you to remember. It's TED, and it stands for Tell Me, Explain, Describe. If you start your sentence with one of those 3 words, you're not going to be doing permission-seeking stuff. And if you think about it, can you tell me this? Can you describe? Can you explain? That's permission seeking. If I skip that and I go right to, tell me more about that. And the key thing is tone, because you have to come across as genuinely interested, not demanding. So I'm not saying, tell me, I'm saying, tell me more. So it's the same words, but it comes across differently.
Absolutely. And that's gold.
It's just not saying, can you?
Yeah. Tell me more. Yeah. That makes sense. It's all in the tonality and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, the other thing, too, is go easy on yourself, because when you start to become more conscious of this, you're going to catch yourself after you've said it. Don't beat yourself up. That's actually a moment to celebrate, because if you can't catch yourself saying it, you'll never be able to stop it. So what you have to do then is, don't go back and look at all your emails to figure out where you use the word just. That's way too humbling, and I definitely don't recommend that. But what I do recommend is correcting yourself in the moment. So if you say something and it wasn't what you intended, just stop and fix it. Just go back. We do that all the time. And no one's going to think twice about it. They won't even know why you're doing it, probably. But it will create a higher perceived presence right there in the moment. I had one young woman come up to me after the end of a workshop, and she said, "You just eliminated my entire vocabulary," because we spent a lot of time on all these other common words. And I laughed because it was a pretty funny line, but it's true. We have tons of bad habits when it comes to communicating, and helping people avoid that. It's amazing how it does change the game. One last quick little thing, another communication thing. It wasn't really a word. It was more a way of speaking. I coached this woman on it because she was missing it completely. And I told her, I said, when you add this to your repertoire, I said, I promise you, people are going to change the way they respond to you, and they won't know why. And it was really funny because she had come to me for coaching because she was being perceived as bombastic at times and very direct, overly direct. 2 weeks later, and she took it on because she knew she was a C-level executive and she knew she needed help. She called me back and she said, I got to tell you this. She said, the president of the company just stopped me in the elevator. And he said, I don't know what it is you're doing differently, but keep it up. I love it. And it's like, it really does make a difference because most of it's operating on an unconscious level. And so, if the president of the company sees a difference but can't identify it, it's not obvious.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, that's so awesome.
Yeah. And since you're on the Abundant Culture podcast, we always like to ask our guests, whether it be in their personal life, their business, at the country club that they go to, whatever the case may be, how do you actually spread abundance?
How do I spread abundance? The best way to spread it is to demonstrate it and to live it. And to be really honest about that. Like, for example, I was in October, I was looking at my calendar and I looked at December and I thought, wow, I don't have much on the calendar in December. And I said, well, I have a choice right now. I can worry about that, or I can be grateful in advance that good things are going to happen. And I've shared this story with a bunch of people, so it's part of my spreading how to be more abundant. And so I said, I'm going to be grateful for all the cool things that are coming. I got booked for 6 days, almost right off the bat, by a fellow trainer who wasn't able to do an assignment, and they asked me to do it. And then one of my favorite clients called me up and had me do another day. So within a very short period of time, December became one of the busiest months of the year, and more than covered what I needed to make. Where if I sat there and worried about it, it would be like, okay, what's that going to look like? I'm doing the same thing right now with March. I'm looking, because I've got, February is totally jammed. I've got all kinds of stuff in April and June. In March, I'm like, okay, I'm not worried about it though, because it's happening. And you just have to trust that.
For sure. Got to believe it.
Yeah. So for the person that maybe they know they need help with their communication. Maybe they keep saying just or can you, or maybe there's an owner of a company out there that has a manager and they just want them to get a little bit more help in managing a team. Or maybe people just think you're like just really awesome. How can they get into contact with you?
Okay, so I love the way you think. That's great. The best way to reach me is on my new website, which is called Sullivan Zale, and it's the word, Sullivan, my last name, Sullivan, and then ZYL.com. Sullivan Zale is a company that I put together with my friend Barry Von Zale and Josseline Ross, and it's a training company, international. They're in South Africa and Europe, respectively. And so that's the thing. We're doing all of this training around energy and listening. Barry is a professional musician. He worked with Johnny Clegg for years. And so, he's played in front of audiences of literally 150,000. So he brings a completely different energy to what we do. And he's a drummer. So it's all about what we call the rhythm of business. So, there's tons of work that we're doing that's really exciting, that's beyond the career coaching that I got started with, where it's much more focused on companies and helping people interact, communicate, the team building. So sullivanzale.com is where you want to go. And if you look me up, just Rob Sullivan, you'll find me, because I've got a couple of websites, but you won't have any trouble.
Awesome. Yeah. So we are so glad that you came on to the podcast today. You gave us very, very extremely valuable information that honestly, I don't think we've actually had any other guests actually talk about on this podcast before. And we really do appreciate your wealth of knowledge that you shared here today.
Oh, absolutely. And, maybe we can reconnect when my book gets a little further along in terms of the publication and whatnot. So
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks. It was really fun. I definitely enjoyed this time.
Thank you.
So that's all we have for today, folks. I hope you got as much value out of this as we did. Keep in mind, the only way we can improve is through constructive feedback. So remember to rate and review this episode. Also, you are not the only person that needs to know this super valuable information. So be sure to subscribe and share as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember to always spread abundance. Peace.